Brother Leroy's not feeling well. I think sinus trouble. He hopes to make it for worship, and we hope that he will, and that he gets better. I think we all feel a little touch of that. The change of the weather, I guess. So we'll just cope and do the best we can, but I'm happy you made it today. We know some are away, and their absence is explained. They're traveling, not with us, so we hope they come back as soon as possible. We're all once again reunited. Even though we're small, we are a tight group. We're close together, and we love each other's presence. I was wondering when I got the call this morning what I could bring as a substitute or fill-in lesson in the interval while, we're not continuing with his series per se on church history, and decided I would share with you some thoughts that I had worked on back in the early 2000s, well, in the late 90s as well, in the early 2000s. At the time I had let that work culminate in a book that I published back then, Training Manual for Cultural Combat. I've mentioned it before, but as I'd forgotten about the book. It had been on my shelf for several years, and I pulled it off the other day out of curiosity to see what I wrote because I forgot, and found out, well, maybe some of the things that were mentioned then will be of importance for us today, and we can still use some of this information. And there's a lot here, so obviously we don't have time to cover even the major points made throughout every chapter of the book. But what I dealt with in the book was the need to train preachers of the gospel, and I didn't mean to limit it to preachers who formally, stand in the pulpit each week. What I meant was to train instruments who will be able to carry the gospel, and that includes everybody. That includes all of us, to carry the gospel to this generation. So what I was doing was exploring the way our contemporaries think. Now, human nature hasn't changed really over the centuries, but each generation has its own emphases and tendencies and sometimes quirks and many perversities. And we have to understand the unique moment in which we live. If we are living in the past, if we think that it's still 1945, and we're making our approach to people in our evangelistic outreach as though we were living in that wonderful era in a way compared to many things that have happened recently, we might not be as effective. We might reach a few, but if we can better understand the events that have transpired over the last several decades, how they affect those around us. If we're out in a home Bible study situation, how likely the prospects in that family where we're studying will be thinking about a number of issues, we may be more effective. We can be more nearly effective, we can say anyway, than otherwise. So that's why I wrote this book. It was a culmination of some research done at Erskine Theological Seminary in South Carolina back in the 90s. And one of the things I addressed was what it is our time, what is it like, and how do people around us think. And I mentioned in one chapter that the older defenses, that is, defenses of the faith, face new foes today. And they are new in a sense, although in another way, they have been around for a long time. One of those foes, of course, the main one at that time, it was a trendy term, was called postmodernism. We still hear it from time to time. I think it's morphed into other words. We use the more current terminology to refer to the same basic ideas and moods in the spirit of our age, but it was called back in the 90s postmodernism. In other words, the idea was we had gone through the modern period where everybody was very optimistic about progress that science and technology could make, bettering our lives in terms of our health and the dwellings where we live, and our food and our transportation and comforts, communication. So we thought that there was just endless progress to be had. That's the modern idea. This is kind of a simplistic way of summarizing it. And the modernist often based his views on the idea that man was doing it. This is man's doing. We are alone in the universe. That's the ultimate form of modernism, especially as we would talk about biblical criticism and modernism. We're all alone in the universe, so we've made it on our own and we're doing pretty well. The Darwinian evolutionary concept had started out as though, by sheer accident of a biology happened. Sheer accident, life came to be. But then by other many accidents, series and series of accidents in the world of mutations, genetically and so on, we ended up with great progress. And we're getting better. The human species is evolving to something higher. The Superman, the Overman, as the Germans would say, Nietzsche and people like that. So this idea of the modernist idea finally collapsed upon itself when people began to, especially after the great world wars, World War I, World War II. It was much harder to maintain the view that everything's getting better. So many became pessimistic. Both are forms of humanism that puts an emphasis on the human as the standard of right and wrong, the human as the standard of all knowledge, what reality is, on me and on you. Both are humanisms. One would be optimistic humanism, and the other is pessimistic humanism. And pessimistic humanism is when modernism looks at itself introspectively, it looks at itself in the mirror, and it realizes it's created a dead-end street. One of the problems with modernism that was based on the assumption of evolution, on the assumption that there is no God, or the idea of God is not relevant to anything that matters in our lives. One of the biggest problems was how it would eat up and destroy the knowledge process itself, our ability to know anything. Now, how is that? Back in the 1940s and 50s, our brother James Bells, Dr. Bells, he had a PhD from Berkeley in philosophy at the time, spoke of this issue in a number of debates with atheists. Now, he's one of the first that I'm aware of that really brought this out much in our brotherhood, where he said, if nature is all there is, then we're just nature. We're just matter in motion. We're just chemistry. We're physics, the laws of physics and operation doing what physics does. And there's no purpose to my life. So when I think a thought, there is no soul that exists apart from the body, according to that viewpoint. There is no spirit. When I think a thought, it's not something outside of my body thinking. It's my body doing. It's a bodily process. A thought in the brain is nothing more than like a secretion of bile from the liver. And many have used that comparison. Because ultimately it's the same thing. It's just chemistry. If that's the case, then people begin to wonder, how can we trust our thoughts? Because we know chemistry, if you get other chemicals mixed in, will change. The processes by different catalysts and so on will change. So if it's just chemistry, then we may have a problem. We can't be sure that our language even describes reality at all. What we think of as reality may just be how the human animal, as they would say it, is coping with its environment on a day-to-day basis. And what we think that works may work for us biologically to survive for a while and maybe to attain some pleasures, but it doesn't mean that it necessarily corresponds to reality. So suddenly, thinking itself was brought into question. And Brother Bells would emphasize this in debates with atheists and say, if atheism is true, you could never really be sure it is for that reason. However, on our premises that God made us, we believe we have a soul and that the mind is really separate and apart from the body itself. Thinking is something more than just bodily processes. Of course, the brain is involved in ways we don't fully comprehend, but thinking involves something we can call mind or spirit or soul, which we know will exist beyond the death of the physical body. So thoughts can have their reality in a logic that ultimately came from the Creator, from God. So it is dependable. So on our terms, it makes sense to speak of how human language can correspond to reality. On their terms, it's iffy. It's very questionable. Well, you see, the problem is, Brother Bells in debates with atheists is not the only one to realize this, because atheists themselves have also come to see that problem. That's what led to postmodernism, as we think of, and the demise of rational thought and the increase of mysticism, subjective feelings, how I feel for the moment. I can't be sure I know what's right, but I know how I feel. And this is an explanation for how many around us think, the way they operate in their daily lives. So I've kind of spoken in general terms to talk about some of the specific things that were in part of this research I did in the past, and mentioned we need to train ourselves better to speak to our time and to understand what's going on. Two of the things that I felt were most important as contributions to the debate had to do with describing our era, what we call postmodernism, and I had come up with 10 characteristics. I might look at those quickly and not spend a lot of time on them. And then ways we can approach the problem as Christians, how we can formulate our message today. Not change it, but find the emphases that are already there in the Bible. And that's the nature of preaching, you know. If you have an audience with certain needs, you try to deal with those needs from the Bible. And you don't preach like, I'm not going to preach against those heathen witch doctors very vociferously this morning, because I don't think many of you have a problem with following voodoo and stuff like that. You see, although the Bible has principles that speak about sorcery and issues like that, it wouldn't be necessary here. And the same is true when we're preparing our defense of the gospel. We want to deal with what's going on in our own era. So we could look briefly at some of the characteristics of postmodernism. And I don't want to spend a lot of time, but the first thing I mentioned here, and this was derived from looking at a number of sources, is what we call subjectivism, from the word subject. I is the subject, the thinking subject. My feelings, my thoughts, private thoughts, matter more than anything. This is the idea. This is the main plank in their platform, really. So you go back to times like Kierkegaard, the radical Dane from the 19th century, who influenced a lot of religious thinking and has also influenced much in philosophy today. And you see that a major emphasis has been placed on subjectivism. If you remember studying your English courses, you had to take some literary courses also in school, probably British literature, English literature, and American literature. There's some pretty interesting stuff. There's a lot of junk, too, a lot of boring stuff. But there are some interesting things that have been written on both sides of the Atlantic. And they help us. Sometimes you have studies in world history. You have translations of the Greek authors and so on. And you get ideas about how people are thinking. Well, there are two ways we often describe the different writers, the different kinds of writers. You have the classical writers, those who think in classical forms. And then they're very rational, very logical. This is more the 18th century, the 1700s kind of writing. And then you move into the 19th century, the 1800s, and you have more romanticism. So they're known as the Romantics, and they place emphasis on feelings. Out of New England, you had a lot of views. They used to call it transcendentalism. And as I study more and more, those thinkers like Emerson and Thoreau, those writers from that period and that era and that region, I would say for some reason, in some way, they were highly influenced by Eastern thought. Now, you know, we haven't completely been isolated from the East. The British have been going to the subcontinent for a long time and bringing back ideas from the pantheists of the East. So transcendentalism was really a kind of warmed over pantheism. And I'm sure on this side of the Atlantic, we picked up a lot of ideas that had been imported into England out of their trips, their trading trips into India. These were very romantic kinds of thinkers. But this is what's going on now. The problem was in the late 20th century, this came back, especially after the 1960s. There was a resurgence in this kind of romanticism, this sort of feelings orientation, which is still with us. And that's one of the major parts of postmodern thinking, or whatever we want to call it today. At the same time, there is something they call the constructivist outlook. From construction, we construct reality by our thoughts and language. There maybe not even be a reality, on its own. But some of this sounds kind of cranky and goofy, Most practical-minded people every day live in the world, and they know there's a lot of reality. It can smash your finger, it can cut your hand, it can cause you not to be able to pay bills. There's a lot of reality out there that faces us every day. But these people who have nothing to do but spend time thinking will say, well, actually, maybe we construct reality. And it's also a radical perspectivalism. Everything is from my perspective. Now, if you want to see that point of view going to seed, you could go to Bishop Berkeley of the 19th century, who had argued that there is no reality and there is no one but me, Bishop Berkeley. I alone exist. This is the theory known as solipsism. Solipsism. You don't exist, but I think I'm carrying on a conversation. I say I'm dreaming that I'm talking to you, but I have no idea there's anybody but me. I may be everything. And so everything that exists is just in my mind. It's just a dream. That's not a new idea. It's been around for a long time. But that's the sort of thing that the radical perspectivalists have adopted among postmoderns. And Many have argued that very sort of thing that's going on today, that we create our own reality in that way. The second major characteristic of postmodernism is skepticism. Skepticism is the tendency to doubt any and everything that's ever told you. That kind of goes along with subjectivism. You tell me something, you say, here are reasons. For example, historically, here's why I believe the United States was a great nation. Now, here's why I believe it's founded on Christian principles. So I go back and I produce these documents. Look how the early framers of our Constitution thought, how they spoke to one another. Oh, yeah, I'd say, but I'm not sure you can prove that. That may not be what they really meant. Skepticism can become such an infection in one's thoughts that person can never trust or believe in anything. Now, that's not new. It's been around, I guess, for millennia. Some of the famous skeptics of Greece, and of course, we talk about Greece because historically, as a part of Europe, thought that came up and was promulgated in Greece trickled over into the rest of Europe and thus also to North America. Our forefathers came from Europe. For the most part, except Betty, she's Pocahontas, I think, a lot of hers. Anyway, I'm just kidding. But these ideas came over, and so we talk about Greece, and among them were the sophists. And you hear of sophistry, and these were people who thought you could never know anything for sure, but you sure can use words as weapons. So the sophists polished their rhetorical skills. They learned to be excellent public speakers. Why? They wanted to sway a crowd. What was the purpose? Money, fame, and mainly power. You use your ability to sway audiences to get things you want. You want to control other people. You do that by much speaking and very adept speaking, very polished speaking. So the sophists would come up with sophistry or arguments. We call it sophisticated. We kind of use that word a little different today, but if you mean it in the literal sense, if it's from the sophists, they used words as weapons. Truth was not the issue. Now, does that sound familiar? Well, of course. That's just about every day's news. Every day's news. Somebody would say, he ought to be impeached. Why? Well, he did this. It was evil to look into Biden's dealings in Ukraine, Biden's son's dealing in Ukraine. That was evil, awful. It's just a war of words. They don't necessarily believe it's true. Part of that problem has to do with our judicial system. As laudable as it is and wonderful it is, we like the fact our judicial system that could defend me or you if I'm accused of a crime is one that's supposed to be objective and neutral, where you have a prosecutor and a defender, and that they're supposed to both get equal say, theoretically, and present their arguments to sway a judge or a jury. We like the fact that it's not just one-sided, not just the prosecutor. But the problem is, if it's a duty of an attorney to defend a defendant, he's not always interested in whether the defendant's really innocent. The truth of the matter sometimes matters to some lawyers, but to many of them it's just winning in court. Stomping the prosecutor. You may be fully convinced this guy's a lowlife and he's murdered some people, but I know some tricky arguments and some slick ways to get him off the hook where they can't prove it. So I'll win. Winning is everything. Well, you get a bunch of lawyers and then you elect them to office. What do? They carry on the tradition. War of words, skepticism. So that's part of the postmodern philosophy of our time. And the tendency of all to doubt everything and to distrust everything. Pluralism is another third factor I would list of postmodernism. Now, pluralism has a number of definitions from the word plural as opposed to singular. And one could just be descriptive pluralism. The fact is there are a lot of beliefs in this country, in this society. You have East Indians, you have Muslims, you have Catholics, you have Protestants and all stripes within that movement. You have New Testament Christians, you have atheists, you have people who follow Native American animistic religions. Just about any kind of thing imaginable is out there. Somebody believes it and practices it. Now that's descriptive. You're just describing the reality, sadly, but there are a lot of people with a lot of weird ideas. But there's another form of pluralism that's a lot worse than just simply describing the way it is. It says there is diversity like that, and it's a good thing. We ought to celebrate it. How was it that Al Gore quoted E pluribus unum, and I botched that up? out of one many. Yeah, out of one many when it's supposed to be out of many one. Well, that's the problem. That he was thinking in those kinds of pluralistic terms. Pluralism. So we don't live in a universe, we live in a multiverse of thought today. And this is the big, and with pluralism comes the idea that since everybody has his own belief, it's not kosher. It's not, well, they wouldn't say it. Well, some of them would. A lot of them would say it that way because they can't help who they are. It's not kosher to criticize somebody else's beliefs. And if you criticize, for example, if you criticized a person retaining Judaistic forms today of faith and practice, which once were valid 2,000 years ago under the economy, the Old Testament economy, but that have now been superseded by the law of Christ. If you dare to say the law of Christ supersedes it and that's now defunct, then they throw at you all kinds of pejorative terms. You're anti-Semitic, which is absurd. I don't have any problem with Shem. And especially don't have any problem with Abraham. I love those men. And I love Jesus, who was Semitic. So these are just words that are used as weapons. So that's part of the problem. Pluralism today, it's a civic friendliness toward every idea. And the consequence is, you people in churches of Christ should never say the Bible is right. And that rules out atheism. It rules out the Quran. It rules out the Vedas of the Hindus. You can't say that you're right and the Muslims are wrong, the Hindus are wrong. You cannot do, that's wrong to do. It's even morally wrong for you to say you're right. And not just in the churches of Christ, but they go farther. It's funny. Denominationalists used to come and reproach us, and they'd say, you people in the Church of Christ think you're the only ones going to heaven. And guess what? The atheists are coming to the Baptists today saying, you Christians think you're the only ones going to heaven. Well, finally, some of them buckle, but many of them say, well, yeah, by definition, Christians are those following the will of God. They're the ones that are ready to meet God. By definition, they're back in the same corner. So it's a silly argument to say that. The question is not, does anybody have the right to believe humbly? I think we found the truth and let's share it with others. Is that right? Is that ever wrong to do when you honestly, sincerely think, this is the truth, we want to share it with you because we love you? You see, now the very monster or the evil genie they let out of the bottle, the denominationalist is coming back to haunt them as well.
But it's always a one-way street with other people. Because, they will tell us that what we believe isn't true, but that very statement is based on them thinking that what they believe is true, and they can be right 100%.
Exactly.
But we can't.
And the irony is this, we'll get into this in a second. I'm looking at a list of 10 characteristics of postmodernism and the era in which we live, and I've mentioned those things. One of them will be, as we'll see in a minute, in the end, naturalism or atheism. That's presupposed behind the postmodernist project. Now, not all postmodernists are atheists, but they've been influenced by the atheists, just like not all socialists are atheists, not all communists are atheists, but most are. By definition, a true doctrinaire communist is an atheist. I mean, Karl Marx was an atheist, Jew. He was an atheist. And Lenin was an atheist, and Stalin became an atheist. He was a theology student in his youth, but he turned against God. He became an atheist. This is just the nature of that system of belief, atheism. And so this is true of many postmodernists. Another characteristic of our time is cynicism. Being cynical, it's really an affront to the progressivist creed of modernism. Now, we talk about liberals today as progressivists, but the postmodernist really has disdain for the progressivist idea, although ironically they are progressivists in the political, social sense. But they deny that there is progress. Another reason we see this all around us is, the fiction the stories that are told for us by smart people who want to control us and change our thinking, especially out in Hollywood and those who publish novels. The stories used to be of how everything was getting better and wonderful, and man is going to live in a great paradise one day. Now it's all different. It's the rise of the machines, in the future will be bleak. It'll be a Mad Max situation, anarchy, and you can't get gasoline. Everybody's out to murder everybody else. You got to defend yourself. I don't think there's been anything that's been presented in the cinema in the last 30 years that's other than that. Any kind of thing dealing with the future, unless it's funny pop fiction, Back to the Future. But most of it is the serious stuff talks about how bleak it will be. We're cynical about everything.
Oh, because this kind of describe Venezuela right now.
Well, the truth is, you take socialism, especially if you have a bunch of knuckleheads that don't even know how to do it. I mean, that's what the socialists always say. But these are really stupid socialists. I mean, there are smarter socialists who, the reason they're smarter is because they're not true socialists. They sneak in capitalist capital. They get the capital from the capitalists. They know socialism will collapse on its own. It's parasitic. You've got to have capitalism making money so that you can siphon off money. Well, the smarter ones like China, they're not good socialists. They long ago figured out they can hold on to Marxist ideas of control of people, but when it comes to the economy, you've got to siphon off the money from the West and have a hybrid capitalist system in your own country, a strange system. But if you take somebody like Venezuela, I hate to be this crass and cruel, but they adopt socialism and they really believe it. It won't work. It won't work. You can't succeed. There's anarchy. And that's what any society will become that adopts pure socialism in that sense. But cynicism is a part of... Now, I mentioned socialism because actually one of the characteristics of postmodernism is what is called communitarianism, from the word community. What's wrong with that, we would think? Now, we're members of the Church of Christ, and we go to church, and we help each other in church. I don't face temptation alone. I don't worship God all by myself, but I'm with my brothers and sisters. And that's a wonderful thing, for example, on Sundays, to worship God. We are a community of believers. Yes, that's good in the Christian context. But the idea that's known as communitarianism is a lot different from that. It basically says you cannot think individually, you cannot reason individually. You are the product of your group, your social group. We are talking like we're talking because we were raised in the South, in the Southeast United States. We were born in the times we were born. People around us influenced us, and we think as we think because that's just the way we were taught as kids. And if we'd been brought up in India, we'd very likely be either Muslims or, more than likely anything, Hindus, some kind of You see, that's not a new idea. Robert Owen had produced that kind of information in the debate with Alexander Campbell. Campbell very well refuted that idea. He pointed out that Owen was born in Scotland and raised in a Christian country, very Presbyterian country. Now he's a free thinker or an atheist. How did you do that if you didn't come up with that on your own? So this is the idea that we think as our groups, all group think, no individuality anymore. Now that's very conducive to strong government, totalitarian regimes. They like communitarianism. Everybody gets in line and conforms to the party line. And this is really part of many of the postmodernist thinkers in the past. There are two strains of thoughts where they came from that led to this situation we call postmodernism. Now, don't think I'm being funny or cute. This is documented. I have some of the footnotes here. The first stream came from Nazi Germany. I am not kidding. Many Nazis and some ex-Nazis too, those who had been Nazis, part of the Nationalist Socialist Party. It's communism, but it's national communism. It's not universal communism. That's the only real difference. Socialism on the country scale rather than on the worldwide scale. So, the Stalinists they want to conquer the world. For that view, the Nazis wanted to conquer the world, make everybody Germans, and kill everybody that weren't good Germans. So that's the basic difference. So the Nazis developed these kinds of ideas, and then, of course, just out and out Marxists, too. This stuff fits very well Marxist-type thinking, and many of the Marxists who came to this country and were allowed to teach in our universities and to infiltrate many of our important institutions brought with them ideas that led to what we call postmodernism. Then another emphasis would be it's kind of anti-scientific, anti-scientism, a disdain for things rational and logical. However, we're living in an age where you can't say everybody around us is postmodern. We're living in a mixed era, a hybrid era. Modernism and postmodernism coexist side by side. Some of the most important thinkers in our time are very modernist. Many of the atheist astronomers and atheist physicists that get on TV and, become superstars on these documentary shows, talking about the evolution of the universe and stuff. These are very scientific in that sense, but they're more scientistic instead of scientific. Scientistic, which is the worship of science, is the only way to answer any question that matters in the world, is through science. So you have the naturalist scientists who move right alongside of their very pessimistic colleagues who are the postmodernists. Now, science still underlies a lot of postmodernism. In fact, I would say postmodernism grew out of the findings of evolutionary science, which would argue that all we are is nature. We're just matter in motion. And this has led to the pessimism of our age. So it's anti-scientific. And along with those ideas, since they say we construct reality, science is just a way of, it's just pragmatic. You use science to get your own wishes fulfilled, but it doesn't matter if it's true within itself or actually corresponds to what's going on out there in the world. And then another a predictable characteristic of the postmodern era would be relativism in terms of our moral beliefs, relativistic ethics. And this goes along with its relativistic view of knowledge, how we come to know anything. And the modernists used to think, sometimes borrowing religious capital, that there are certain things that are right and certain things that are wrong. But the postmodernist says it's all dependent upon not the individual. Now, many modernists were individualistic relativists, but it depends upon your group. Your group, your church, for example, defines right and wrong. Your region of the country. But then who decides what we're thinking in our region? This is a mixed region. You go 40 miles east of here, you get into a very different culturally regional part of the state of Georgia than you are in West Georgia. This is Alabama, culturally extended. This is Alabama. Thank God for Alabama. And thank God for South Georgia, and maybe extreme North Georgia. But you get in the middle of the state and you have a different place culturally, and you have a lot of relativistic beliefs. Then we have, tolerance, which goes along with pluralism, the idea that you tolerate and respect any idea, which means you should never speak about the evils of sexual perversity. And they'll throw terms like homophobic or anything like that at you, as though that's supposed to be the end of the discussion. But just using, those kinds of words. But tolerance is the idea you have to tolerate everything. And if you don't, we won't tolerate you. Chris was talking about the irony of their views when they claim that you're not supposed to say any one view is right. But their view is right, the view that no one view is right. And they will impose it on you. So that's part of the regime. And you get that out of ex-Nazis and communists. And then neo-pragmatism, it's the new form of pragmatism. You had people like William James earlier in the late 19th, early 20th century, who influenced people like John Dewey, William James, and others. They have influenced our educational system, sadly, our government schools. And they developed what's called a purely American philosophy. Others in the world have adopted it, but it started here mainly. Pragmatism. What's real and what's true, according to this view, is what works for me. It works for me. Somebody says, "Why are you a Wiccan? Why do you go out there and stand half naked in the cold at night, around some stones you've erected, and like you're reenacting ancient Druid mystic ceremonies and stuff?" Well, I like it. Works for me. Makes me happy. It's not because I can establish this on a firm basis, rationally, but I like it. So that's another major part. Pragmatism. It works for me. Works for me. And of course, that's just another form of skepticism. And last of all, as I mentioned, and most important, should have been first because it's the reason for the rest of this, is philosophical naturalism. Naturalism says all there is nature, so it effectively rules out God and the spirit world. So those are the main characteristics of postmodernism. What I tried to do was to formulate a way that we can possibly train ourselves to answer the challenges of our time. And I'm not going to go into all the introduction here. I mentioned Rush Limbaugh's brother. I had a long discussion with him over some things by email. I asked the question, are we combat ready? Cultural combat. We're in a civil war of values.
But to go back to that last point, which it is, I was thinking that it's the very basis of all of those other things, the non-belief in God, because that's what everything we do is based around. We start with that premise that God exists, and then from there it's, well, okay, so do I have a responsibility to God? What is that responsibility? What do I need to do to make God pleased with me? How can I know what God wants? So all those questions are answered in the Bible. If you don't believe in God, well then what do you do? Basically all you have is, this world, this life. And what about this life? Well, you have certain needs. You have your physical needs. So what is to stop you? You're disconnected from God. You're disconnected from the sets of rules that govern a godly person's life. What prevents you from wanting to have power and more power over other individuals and money and then this, that, and the other? And so then you get into the political arena, which, that's basically what everything is now. It's just nothing but raw politics.
The point you're making is a very profound one, and one I wish that all of our brothers and sisters in the pews could see everywhere. Because many, as Francis Schaeffer used to say, see the problems of our time in bits and pieces. Homosexual rights. The Supreme Court affirmed marriage for homosexuals. You see abortion on demand. New York State House allows for any reason, and so on. You see all that as disconnected problems. When he said we ought to see it as one big issue. Now, Chris mentioned you start out with the idea of God, and then every other question that you raise and answer will be answered in light of that premise. If God exists, then yes, there is such a thing as real moral right or oughtness and real wrong. Some things are just intrinsically wrong and should not be done, no matter what any politician says or judge in a court. So you have that. Then you have every issue that faces us is answered differently, beginning from your starting point. If you believe there is no God, as he said, it's just raw power, survival of the fittest. I'm going to get what's mine. It's dog eat dog, and so everything about it is answered that way. That's why one's worldview, we call that the worldview. Your worldview begins with how you answer the question, where do we come from? If it's from God, then your worldview will be very, very different. Another world. You're living in another world, another middle world, from what somebody sitting beside you on the bus who starts out from the idea that all there is nature. He or she's in a totally different world, a worldview. Now, a lot of things that we share in common on a day-to-day basis, but many times they share their ideas inconsistently. They're living in a Christian culture still, last vestiges thereof, and they've borrowed a lot of ideas from us. But the more consistent they become, the more dangerous they become. And this is why politics is becoming more and more radicalized. Because for so long, many secular humanists and philosophical naturalists have been elected to office or appointed to judgeships, and it's taking its toll now. You have fewer and fewer godly Christian people. We might call them evangelicals, Bible believers. Put them in there. Don't put a Mormon in there or some loon. You don't want a situation where you have that worldview, where the idea that God is a man and you have to wear special underwear and other weird stuff like that. We don't want that. That would have its own problems too. But somebody, and we would hope there would be members of the church. I pray, maybe I shouldn't. But I don't see how it could be wrong. And I don't know if this is just a prayer, but I pray something would happen to the thinking of our present president, that he would have a conversion experience and not just become an evangelical, but he would become a Christian. Wouldn't that be wonderful if something happened, he became a New Testament Christian? He's the kind of guy that if he did, he'd stick to his guns. He would probably not back down easily. We could only hope. Somebody says, well, that never happened. Well, wait, look at the Apostle Paul. Somebody said Saul of Tarsus would never turn into a great proponent of Christianity. He was the worst enemy the early church had. Persecuting Christians, violating them, debating with them everywhere, and suddenly he became something else. So it could happen. I would pray that happen, and people in positions of power will change. Why do I want him to become a member of the church? Well, his worldview will be so much in line with the way reality really is, and so much more helpful to us. Are we combat ready, I ask? And Talked about how we have in the Bible a command, we have a mandate to give a defense of the faith. But not just a defense, I stated a rational defense. Now by that I mean this. This is a problem in the brotherhood. Too many of our own preachers and teachers in our Bible colleges and in our universities over the years, and a lot who publish, have said things like faith is somewhere halfway between knowledge and uncertainty. Faith is kind of a halfway house between certain knowledge and incredulity, just total uncertainty. That is absolutely not true. That view of faith is technically known as I've mentioned several times, fideism. Fideism, the Latin word for faith. Fideism, and it's the belief that my subjective experience and my decision to believe is all that matters. Faith is just a will to believe. It's a leap in the dark beyond the evidence. I want to believe in Christ, and so I will believe in Christ. You can't prove it. That's another thing the fideist is fond of saying. You can't prove there is a God or that Christ was his son. You cannot prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, or any kind of proof at all, really, rational proof, that the Bible is inspired. But now we believe that because, we want to believe that. We take that leap of faith. I know, isn't that so holy and pious and so higher, so much more devoted to God than the one who has to have proof, they would say, as they want to caricature it? The problem is fideism is not faith at all. And it comes from the idea that my immediate experiences define reality. It's like the pragmatism we discussed a while ago, the neo-pragmatism of the postmodern. It's real to me. It works for me. Hey, that's fine. I've spoken, to some friends who were even nominally Christians in the denominations around, and talked. One of them was a preacher friend of mine in this area, and I'm asking him about how he knows certain things, and he says, "Well, I know you don't have to be baptized, for example, for the remission of sins because God tells me so." Well, how did God tell you that? Is it in the Bible? No. God told me that. God spoke to me, and he told me that. I said, okay, I'm just trying to understand this. Now, how do you know God speaks? Oh, you just know. When God speaks to you, you just know it. Yeah, but are you sure? What if you are imagining God speaking to you? Well, you know the difference. How? Well, you just know. I said, suppose a couple of Mormon missionaries knocked on your door. Now, they make the same claims for Mormonism. That if you will to believe it, you'll believe Joseph Smith was a prophet from God. You've got a will to believe it. And they come to you saying God speaks to them, and you are a Baptist and you claim God speaks to you. You don't accept their ideas. They don't accept yours. How do you break the impasse? You say, well, I just know God's talking to me. God tells me they're wrong. Well, they say the same thing about you. Well, they're wrong. He said.
That happened to Muhammad too. Remember the satanic verses where, Satan started telling him things and he thought it was God telling him things. And then
it happened to, it's funny you mentioned, it happened to their founder, Joseph Smith, among the Mormons. He said to a couple of his proteges to take the Book of Mormon to Toronto, Canada. He was in New York. I think that's where this was from, or it might have been Illinois. But they'd migrated west. Go into Toronto, and God has told me in a revelation, you will get a copyright, you will secure the copyright for the book, and we'll sell it and make a lot of profit off of the Book of Mormon. Well, they went and spent several weeks there, if not months, in Toronto, and came back utterly failed. Nobody bought up the copyright at the time in Toronto. And they were consternated. But prophet, you said God revealed that to you. He said, well, God gave me another revelation since you brought that up, and said, some revelations are from God, and some are from the devil, and some are from my own mind. Well, now the problem is, how do you know the difference? See, all this is what we call subjective immediacy. That my feelings are the criterion of right and wrong. I feel this must be true, therefore it is. Fideism says, I want to believe, therefore I do. Look, brethren, we do not depend upon that. The Bible teaches us to give an answer, 1 Timothy 3:15, to give an answer to every man who asks us of a reason of the hope that is in us with meekness and fear. We are to give a reasoned answer. We're to set forth evidences. The Apostle Paul says that the pagans are without excuse in Romans chapter 1, 18 to 20. He said, because the things that are made, in other words, the created world, clearly speak of the existence of God, so that they are without excuse. You know, what may be known of God is manifested to them, for God hath shown it to them. Even the invisible things of God are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. This world. Now, this world is a fact, and most parties to the debate agree it exists. There are a few weirdos, but generally speaking, we know there is a world, and I'm here. How do I explain all of this? Where did it come from? Here's a fact to be explained, and the very best explanation is that a creator who's above this world and superior to this world already existed and made it all. This is a temporary world. Somebody says, well, I'm not a sophisticated philosopher. How am I supposed to give an answer to every man who asks me? Let me point this out. When it comes to doing apologetics or answering people and giving evidences, you don't have to remember all the details of philosophy and stuff. There's a very simple way to talk to somebody. Suppose somebody you know is kind of doubting. I'm not sure God exists. I'd like to believe. I don't know there is a God. You could ask that friend, do you believe that some things are always wrong? What do you mean, he might ask, or she might ask. Well, is it always wrong to be cruel to young babies? Is it wrong just in the nature of things to be cruel to children? Well, of course, he would say. Almost everybody would say, of course it's wrong to be cruel to a child. Well, what makes that wrong? Well, everybody knows. No, sadly, not everybody does. There are some really horrible monsters out there that hurt children. And they think they're okay and they're justified. They're perfectly satisfied until they get caught. They still don't have any pangs of conscience or remorse about it. They'll do it again when you let them out, if they get loose. Oh, of course it's wrong. So, well, what makes anything wrong? Is it wrong to mistreat your friends? Suppose your friends do everything good for you, and you respond by double-crossing them and taking away everything they got and maligning them and talking bad about them behind their back. Any country in the world would say, that's dirty pool. That's pretty bad. Even the Russians say that. Even the Chinese communists would say that. Suppose your wife is being attacked, and you watch the man attack her, your children, and you just back off and say, I don't want to get involved. I didn't start it. What kind of person are you? You know, you won't protest anyway, or push, or call the cops. You know, somebody that runs in battle, you don't admire them if they're running in a battle of defense. So there are some things that everybody knows would be wrong. It was wrong for the Nazis to murder all the Jews. It doesn't matter about your disagreement of that, about their politics and about their social positions or their religion, and we have them. But to take innocent people, regardless of their beliefs, and just slaughter them, there's no justification for that. Well, what makes it wrong? Like Chris said to start with, if there is no God, might makes right. Right doesn't mean anything. It's just whatever I can do and get away with. And this is what the Nazis thought, by the way. You know, Hitler was an atheist. He became an atheist. And his whole belief system was predicated upon the idea that I don't answer to any power higher than myself. And the more guns I can get and the more soldiers I can get regimented behind me, the more power I have. If not, why not? You know? So that's the nature of the political problems we face too today and always have with atheism. Well, you can ask somebody what makes anything right or wrong and get them to see, apart from the existence of a superior personal being, God, there is no such thing as true morality. We have customs, we have conventions, but they can easily be changed. Tomorrow, our society, our Supreme Court to declare it's okay to molest children 2 years old. And I wouldn't be surprised if this court, with some of the creeps who are on this court, didn't say something sort of like that. Some of them have advocated similar things, at least 12-year-old. I think Ginsburg was on record with the 12-year-olds. That's okay. I mean, but would that make it right? No. We all realize it's still wrong. And that is, to me, a really good way of getting people. You don't have to be a philosopher. Just get them to see. There has to be a God to explain right and wrong. And you know there's right and wrong. Your conscience won't let you deny it. Thomas Warren, in the debate we saw here a few years ago with Anthony Flew, kept bringing that up. Flew had been a war hero with the RAF. He had fought in the Battle of Britain. He'd flown planes, and he rightly deserved respect as an atheist. Even then, he was a great military man. And he thought the Nazis were monsters. And Dr. Warren asked him, Brother Warren, What made it wrong? Well, it's just wrong what they did. Killing these innocent Jews and putting little children in boxcars quoted with quicklime so they would burn to death slowly and agonizing. That was wrong. What made it wrong? You remember Brother Warren would bring it. What made it wrong? Well, it's just wrong, he says. It's just wrong. Just wrong. What makes it wrong? Given your view, the Nazis could do whatever they wanted because there's no law higher than the laws of Germany. Till the Allies, won and invaded. The laws of Germany were the highest law. Well, of course, there is a higher law. And 2 or 3 years later at Nuremberg, you remember the famous Nuremberg trials? Nazi war criminals were put on trial for the crimes they'd committed against many people, especially Jews. And their defense was, they had an opportunity to defend themselves. Their defense was, we were obeying orders. The laws of our country at the time said, we are to kill these people. We are to get them out. That's the way to solve the Jewish problem. That's the solution, the final solution. That's what we were commanded to do. We're supposed to obey orders. Justice Jackson was an American prosecutor, and I'm so thankful we had an opportunity to have him there. And he spoke to the court, and he pointed out there is a higher law that transcends the provincial and the transient. In other words, the law of Germany at the time under the Hitler regime. And it's a law to which we all answer. It's not the law of The Hague. It's not the law of, the League of Nations or of the United Nations. Because all the nations could decide after all, and they probably would, the wimps they are, yeah, the Nazis are okay, we'll let them off the hook. They can do what they want in their own country. The nations could say that, but it would still be wrong what the Nazis did. It would still be wrong. And he said there's a higher law. Of course, that was the American who believed in God. That was the pre-1960s American. I don't think you would get a Nuremberg trial today. Oh, who are we to judge the Nazis? That's the silliness you get of our time. But then they knew, and even Flew knew, we're fighting them because they are evil. What makes them evil? They're violating the laws of humanity. The laws of humanity? No, the laws of Germany. And that was a lot of humanity. Millions of people said to do that. Well, the Germans were wrong. What made them wrong? They violated the moral law. There can be no moral law apart from God. That is a very strong argument for God, and you can use that. You can just reason with people about it. And there are many others, but some of those, don't require a lot of technical knowledge of science and stuff. People are without excuse. Anyway, my point in this book that I wrote was to train people to engage in a kind of apologetic enterprise we call classical, it's called evidentialism, evidentialist apologetics. That's over against fideism. It's over against another Calvinist idea known as presuppositionalism, that if you're one of the elect, God will give you faith miraculously. It will be a presupposition and everything else will flow from that. If you're not one of the elect, too bad, you won't understand it. That's dyed in the world Calvinism. It's opposed to all of that. Evidentialism says God has given us the evidences. We present those to others and we use them ourselves to be strengthened in our faith. I'm convinced we failed in churches of Christ. Too many times we failed. A brother wrote an article, and it was out here on our back stand a few years ago from Louisiana, in which he said, why are we losing our young people? He's a youth director. He's a youth worker. Why are our young people leaving the church when they grow up and get out of high school? He said, it's easy to answer. I talk to them. I know. They don't see Christianity as true anymore. Now, what's wrong? Well, the reason they don't see it as true is they spend day after day after day, week after week in classroom situations where the government schools tell them you're nothing but just slime mold evolved into a higher monkey-like being. That's all you are. And it gets so ingrained in them, they don't think any differently. They see it on television every day and all the stories that are told, all the narratives out there, so that they become skeptics. Now, we have got to counteract that. Well, we got Sunday morning Bible class. It lasts, 45 minutes? And Wednesday night, 45 minutes, maybe 90 minutes a week. Thank God for those 90 minutes. You can get the truth out in 90 minutes, but maybe we ought to do more. And my emphasis when I wrote this book was on training preachers to preach apologetically, not apologizing, but in terms of defense of the faith. In other words, in every sermon, find a way, if you can, to bring in something that will be faith strengthening. Refute a false idea. You can't do it in every sermon. Sometimes you spend the whole sermon on it. Sometimes just a few points here and there. But everything should be geared toward that. Yes, it should be Christ and Him crucified. That should be the central point. Christ and Him crucified. But that point can be made strengthened or strong by showing how we believe there was a Christ and what are the evidence to show He was crucified and what that means. This inspired word that tells us it was for our atonement. So I believe we need to do better in teaching Christian evidences and apologetics to our kids. Any questions or comments? Well, appreciate your time.